The Stone Age never happened. At least, that is what the holy books of most religions tell us directly. Bible scholars agree that our world was created between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. It so happened that after gastronomic experiments with apples, the first people instantly moved to settled agriculture, invented sophisticated tools and writing, and then began to kill each other in the name of good. In 1654, Irish Archbishop James Ussher calculated that man was created at exactly 9 a.m. on October 23, 4004 BC. The Orthodox Church gave another date, 5508 BC. The Mayan Indians believed that God created the world and the first humans on August 13, 3114 BC. The clay and wood Vedas were unsuccessful. The Hindu Puranas, canonical texts of Hinduism, give a figure of 77.7 trillion years. For comparison, scientists date the Big Bang to a maximum of 20 billion BCE, and Buddhists as always got out of the situation, declaring that history goes in a circle, and the dawn of humanity comes right after its sunset. Unfortunately, none of the world's religions contains a myth about how on April 1, 1,000 years BC, the gods hid dinosaur skeletons and flint arrowheads in the ground to laugh heartily at archaeologists. The Stone Age came independently and even contrary to the beliefs of billions of people. It began about 100,000 years ago, and in some regions of the planet, lasted until the modern age. The active development of civilization coincided with the end of the last ice age about 10,000 years ago. The sea level rose, the climate changed, and mankind began to adapt quickly to the new conditions, to create sophisticated tools, to lay down permanent settlements, to actively hunt. People of the late Stone Age were not much different from you and me. Brain volume, skull structure, body proportions, degree of hair, and other characteristics were about the same as modern ones. If a child of that time had come to the present day, he could have grown up, gotten an education, and until relatively recently, most people could rightfully be considered Negroes. The mutation of the white-skinned gene SLC24F5 began in Europeans only 12,000 years ago and ended 6,000 years ago. Dark skin coloration likely varied from region to region. The most common hair color was black. Blondes and redheads began to appear later. As the human population increased, mutations diversified, eventually creating different types of appearance. It is assumed that Stone Age people dyed their hair with herb juices, flower pollen, and colorful clays, not only for ritual, but also for aesthetic reasons. Scientists claim that our DNA set goes back to two common ancestors, tentatively called Adam and Eve. By examining gene drift, they found that Eve lived about 140,000 years ago, and Adam lived 60,000 years ago. This does not necessarily mean that we are descended from two people. The common ancestors of many humans can be traced back to about 1000 BC. We only got mitochondrial DNA from Eve, passed down through the maternal line, and the Y chromosome from Adam. Both of our progenitors lived in Africa. Almost all depictions of Stone Age people are somewhere outdoors, usually in the middle of the vast steppe, or sitting around campfires. Such representation is true for the Paleolithic period, but it does not reflect the realities of the Neolithic period, 7,000 years BC. Man began to erect the first structures, large stones that serve as his support for the roof of branches, almost 2 million years ago, and 4.5 thousand years ago, he was already building giant pyramids. So by the end of the Ice Age, architectural knowledge was sufficient to build long-term settlements. Early Stone Age culture was remarkably uniform. All over the planet, people used similar tools and made almost identical things with them. 25,000 years ago, near the village of Dolní Věstonice, Czech Republic, houses were built of mud bricks. In Siberia, tents were made of hides and tusks of mammoths. And when it came to burials, our ancestors were not lazy to move huge stone slabs, making impressive megalithic graves. In addition, massive stone blocks were used for signs limiting some territory, monuments in honor of some events, and in some cases, they were turned into objects of worship. Large cities began to be built about 5,000 years ago. For example, Mohenjo-daro, Hill of the Dead, in modern Pakistan, had several tens of thousands of inhabitants, and in one citadel alone, 5,000 people could gather simultaneously. But the bulk of humanity lived in small settlements that could be abandoned if the soil or natural resources were depleted. The typical Stone Age village was a kind of tourist camp. Hunting societies were characterized by tents made of hides, while in agricultural settlements houses were made of stone or reeds. Nearby were green fields of rice, cultivated since 9000 BC, or flowing rivers. The first fish bones began to appear at human settlements 50,000 years ago, and by the Stone Age our ancestors already knew how to fish. The first houses were round one-room houses. Soon people began to build something resembling modern multi-room cottages, which served as burial vaults at the same time. Bones of dead relatives were buried under the floor, covered with skins or straw. According to the excavation data, doors were made in the ceilings. People climbed in and out of the houses using ladders. Clay served as wallpaper, and the walls of houses could be painted from inside. For example, the settlement of Saddle-Giyuk in Turkey. Israeli Jericho is considered to be the most ancient of permanently inhabited cities of the planet. It was laid 11,000 years ago. By the standards of that time, the city was huge, 40,000 square meters, from 200 to 1,000 inhabitants, a stone tower, and a stone wall. In the Bible, it was destroyed by sounds of trumpets and shouts of warriors, but archaeologists blame it on an earthquake. The streets had no layout, and the houses were built as they were. Room sizes were about 7 by 4 meters. The floors were made of sandstone or clay. Decorations, skulls of ancestors with restored facial features, made of clay and eyes made of shells. A typical human day of that time began shortly before sunrise and ended shortly after sunset. The rhythm of life was very leisurely by today's standards. The main areas of work were within walking distance. Only hunters traveled considerable distances from settlements, which had a very unfavorable effect on their life expectancy. It should be borne in mind that 10,000 years ago, the whole mankind numbered only about 5 million people, and the population of villages numbered dozens of inhabitants, most of whom were related to each other. Wild animals, not frightened as they are today, but angry, hungry, and considering a meeting with a human as something like a happy hour in an expensive restaurant, sat almost under every bush. There were tigers and lions in Europe. There were still woolly rhinoceroses and even mammoths. The Stone Age would be to the liking of those who profess the motto, live fast, die young. The fact is that the average life expectancy was 20 to 30 years. The dawn of civilization can hardly be called paradise. It was a very harsh and dangerous time, when the main argument when meeting an animal or a stranger was a stone axe. The main part of the daytime was spent on preparing food, replacing worn-out tools with new ones, repairing dwellings, religious rituals, and taking care of children. The latter was in direct correlation with low life expectancy. The marriageable age was low and children were given much less care than they are now, which understandably affected child mortality. The shortage of men stimulated polygamy, so that 2 to 3 wives of 15 years for one old man of 30 years were not uncommon. Matriarchy dominated Neolithic societies for the same reasons. Women lived longer than men, kept the family hearth, and were actually responsible for the accumulation of cultural experience. The Neolithic was the age of women. They were much more numerous than men on the streets of settlements. Contrary to some stereotypes, Stone Age people did not walk around in smelly skins on their naked bodies. Neolithic fashion was quite diverse and in some cases could compete with medieval fashion. 7,000 years ago, our ancestors began to make clothes from felt. At the same time appeared linen fabric, wool and yarn, and in the 30th century BC, the Chinese established the production of silk. Add to that jewelry made of polished bone, feathers, and colored stones, and a person born before the invention of writing would fit right in most of today's third world countries. Moreover, if a Neolithic dandy wore bracelets or shell beads, it would put him on a par with the owner of a Patek Philippe watch today. Remote settlements practiced barter, but 10,000 years ago, some places already had a developed market economy. Money, shells or stones, was often worn as jewelry. It was convenient for bride price, division of inheritance, or trade with neighboring tribes. Gourmets had nothing to do in the Stone Age. The transition to sedentary agriculture meant a deterioration in the quality of food, because hunters and gatherers had a more varied diet. It's not easy for modern man to imagine a Neolithic diet, no tea or coffee. The main drink was unboiled water from the nearest body of water. Herbal decoctions were made only for medical and religious purposes. Milk was considered the drink of children, and alcohol, or rather fermented juice, was used much less often than it is now. Cooking was in its infancy, so vegetables were eaten raw. There was a lot of meat and fish on the tables. Pigs, goats, and sheep were domesticated 9,000 years ago. But the concepts of salt and spices were absent in the cook's vocabulary. For some time, legumes and cereals were consumed without heat treatment. They were grinded into a paste with water and eaten as porridge. One day someone decided to heat this mixture over a fire for the sake of interest. This is how bread, one of the oldest and most important human foodstuffs, appeared. Scientists assume that, despite the isolation of settlements, Stone Age Europeans, if they could not freely understand each other, they could almost certainly guess the meaning of most phrases. There is an opinion that in those times there existed a certain Proto-Indo-European language with a uniform structure and universal roots of words. In conditions of widespread illiteracy of the population, the most important of arts were painting, music, and war. The oldest artistic artifact is considered to be the so-called Venus of Tantan, a stone figurine found near the city of Tantan in Morocco. It was sculpted 300,000 years ago, so by the beginning of the Stone Age, human culture was already booming. Upper Paleolithic rock art went down in the books. It is often regarded as the main art form of the Stone Age, although one might as well think that the crowning achievement of Mendeleev's research was alcohol. To promote material art to the masses began, oddly enough, the ancient Japanese. It is believed that they were the first on the planet to develop pottery, earlier than agriculture. 11,000 years ago, they already had clay figures and dishes, on which before firing they applied various patterns with the help of braided ropes or sticks. In the fishing settlement of Lepenski Vrh, 7th millennium BC, modern Serbia, stone was used to make figures of fish, or, according to another version, magical fish people. In the 5th millennium BC, people of the European Vinca culture carved something suspiciously resembling cuneiform on clay products. It is assumed that it was a proto-writing, something between drawings and symbols. Unfortunately, small works of art of that epoch have been very poorly preserved. On the other hand, there are many megaliths, the most famous of which is Stonehenge. It should not be thought that decorating tombstones with spiral carvings was a favorite pastime of artists of that time. Stone tools offered little scope for creativity. Even embroidering leather with bone needles was a problem. Generously decorated ornaments, weapons, and armor appeared only in the Bronze Age. Music was much better. It evolved from hunting imitations of animal sounds. In the beginning, the only musical instrument was the human throat. In the Stone Age, people started making musical instruments 22 years ago. An 8,000-year-old flute made of herringbone was found in China, which implied that ancient people were familiar with musical notes at least. Stringed instruments did not appear until the late Stone Age. It is likely that learning to play music in the Stone Age was mechanical, without any abstract system. The first musical notation on clay tablets dates from the 14th century BC, Ugarit, modern Syria. Anyone who has played Sid Meier's Civilization knows well that if a map is small and there are many players, the first unit in the first city should be a warrior. The fact that stone walls were built around cities speaks volumes. It was in the Stone Age that organized armies and professional warriors began to appear. Armies is a bit of a mouthful, of course. Letters from El Amarna, correspondence of Egyptian officials, 1350 BC, say that detachments of 20 men terrorized entire cities, and this was already in the Bronze Age. The Stone Age was shaken by grandiose battles of several dozen people. However, some researchers believe that large settlements like Sayt al-Guduk could have had about 100 soldiers. In this case, we can already talk about tactics, maneuvers, supplies, and other charms of real wars. Conflicts were incredibly bloody. The victors killed all the men and children, took the women, and completely looted the settlements. However, in some regions, there could be tribes that lived in peace with each other and were practically unfamiliar with the concept of killing. A modern example would be the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert. The most feared weapon of the ancient hunters was fire. They set fire to forests and grass, destroying the enemy's habitat. The scorched earth tactic was much more effective than hand-to-hand combat. In close combat, both hunting tools, primarily spears, and clubs were used. According to the rock drawings, it is possible to reconstruct an average battle of the Stone Age. The warring armies lined up opposite each other in lines. The chiefs came forward and gave the command to open firing from bows, slingshots. Certain elements of the drawings suggest that the infantry at this time tried to outflank the enemy. Professor Lawrence Keeley has estimated that conflicts between tribes broke out almost every year, and some of them fought constantly. Excavations of some settlements in Africa have shown that over half of their inhabitants died violent deaths. Stone Age wars were many times more bloody than they are today. Transferring the level of military casualties to the realities of today, any localized war would have claimed 2 billion lives. With the shift from hunting to farming, the number of wars decreased dramatically. populations were still small enough to support idle warriors. Conflicts were fleeting, and there were no siege devices, so walls almost always ensured that the city was invulnerable. The words Stone Age are usually used in a pejorative sense, to denote primitiveness, stupidity, and savagery. Indeed, the early Neolithic was an age when cracking skulls was considered far more interesting than trading. With the transition to agriculture, however, the world changed beyond recognition. Labor turned the ape into a man. It also turned bloodthirsty maniacs into architects, sculptors, painters, and musicians. The Stone Age wasn't such a bad time at all. Healthy lifestyle, good ecology, diet, constant physical activity, and the tranquility of small villages. Sincere belief in gods and magical monsters. Isn't this the foundation for any fantasy?